far reaches of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog blankets the ridges and the roads turn to mud long before you reach your destination. There are whispers of a family so violent, so gruesome, that even other clans feared them. They were the Porters, a bloodline soaked in cruelty, madness, and rituals so grotesque that even hardened mountain folk refused to speak their name out loud, unlike many clans whose horrors were born of secrecy and isolation. The Porter line thrived on spectacle. Their cruelty wasn't hidden in dark cabins or whispered about in hushed tones. It was displayed in broad daylight, carved into their victims, and branded into the land they ruled, from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century. The Porter name struck terror into every hollow, creek, and ridge where their presence lingered. The first stories came from loggers in 1887. Men went missing in the forests near Bloodroot Ridge, a dense tangle of pine and oak so thick that even sunlight struggled to break through. When a search party finally went looking, they stumbled across something so vile that grown men refused to continue. Pinned to trees with rusted spikes were the bodies of the missing loggers. But it wasn't just the killings, it was the way they had been displayed. Each body had been flayed, skinned in precise patterns that revealed the muscles beneath. Their skin wasn't discarded, but instead stretched across wooden frames like crude tapestries. Spirals and jagged symbols burned into the flesh. The air reeked of smoke, blood, and decay, and hanging in the center of the clearing was a wooden sign carved with 3 words: Porter Blood Feeds. Locals claimed the Porters were more than just killers. They were artists of cruelty, and their art was flesh. They didn't eat out of hunger alone, but out of a grotesque devotion to what they called the Red Law, belief that life was only meaningful when bled, carved, and consumed. To the Porters, pain wasn't something to hide. It was the truest expression of existence. As decades passed, their reputation only grew. Travelers vanished near the ridge. Families who dared settle close to Porterland found livestock drained of blood, their bodies arranged in spirals across fields. Those spirals appeared everywhere the Porters went, burned into barns, carved into tree bark, even etched into the bones of their victims. No one knew exactly what the symbols meant, but survivors swore they glowed faintly in firelight, as though the markings carried a power deeper than cruelty alone. The leader of the clan during the early 1900s was Thomas Red Eye Porter, a man so deformed by generations of inbreeding that his face seemed permanently twisted into a leer. His left eye bulged larger than the other, red and swollen, and he wore the skin of his enemies as a cloak. Witnesses said he carried a knife carved from a human femur, its blade smeared with blood, so often it never dulled. Red Eye was not just a killer, he was a showman. He'd march through mountain paths with trophies dangling from his belt, daring any soul to challenge him. None ever did. One survivor, a trapper who escaped their grasp in 1914, described being dragged into a Porter gathering. He was tied to a stake as dozens of malformed figures circled him, chanting guttural words in unison. They wore masks stitched from human skin, and in their hands they carried bones sharpened into blades. The trapper swore he saw children among them, small and pale, smearing blood across their faces while giggling as though it were a game. By sheer luck, he broke free and fled into the woods. He never returned to the mountains again. Law enforcement tried to intervene, but each attempt failed. Officers who entered the ridge either vanished or returned shaken, refusing to speak of what they saw. Locals whispered that the Porters didn't just know the land, they controlled it. They could vanish into the trees, stalk their prey in silence, and appear suddenly with howls that froze blood in the veins. Some said they drugged their victims with strange powders, hallucinogenic herbs that grew in the hollows, making them easy to manipulate and break before the killing began. By the 1930s, the Porters were less a family and more a cult. Their gatherings grew larger, their rituals more elaborate. Some described bonfires where bodies were split open, entrails draped like garlands across trees. Others spoke of blood choirs, where victims were kept alive just long enough to scream in rhythm as the clan chanted and danced. The spirals became more intricate, sometimes filled with ash, sometimes drawn with fresh blood. Each one seemed like a marker, a warning, or perhaps even an invitation. Folklorists who studied Appalachian legends began to speculate that the porters weren't simply sadistic, they were attempting to summon something. The spirals, the chants, the careful arrangements of flesh and bone. They looked eerily similar to ancient ritual practices found in indigenous myths, where blood offerings were said to open doorways to other realms. Could it be that the porters, twisted and inbred as they were, had uncovered a ritual that linked their savagery to something older, darker, and not entirely human? Whether supernatural or not, the terror was real. Entire communities uprooted and fled when rumors spread that the porters were near. Mothers told their children not to stray after dark, warning that the porters would take them and turn their bones into flutes. Hunters avoided certain hollows, claiming they heard laughter echoing in the trees where no human could be seen. And, every so often, another body would appear stretched, burned, and marked with spirals. The porters weren't ghosts. They weren't myths. They were flesh and blood, living nightmares who reveled in cruelty. And in the heart of Appalachia, their legacy was just beginning. Because if the first chapter of their history was brutality, the next was something far worse. By the mid-20th century, the Porter clan had transformed from a family of killers into something resembling a secret society of blood. Their gatherings became less like spontaneous hunts and more like orchestrated ceremonies, structured, methodical, and frighteningly consistent. What began as a grotesque obsession with flesh evolved into a full-blown religion, and its high priests were none other than the inbred descendants of Thomas, Red-Eye Porter. Survivors who stumbled onto their rituals described scenes too horrific for most to believe. Entire clearings would be converted into makeshift altars, with bones arranged in perfect spirals, radiating outward from a central post. Victims, sometimes strangers, sometimes unlucky locals, were tied there, their mouths stuffed with rags, to stifle their screams. Around them, the porters would dance, painted with ash and blood, their faces hidden behind masks sewn from stretched human skin. Each porter bore disfigurements from generations of inbreeding, limbs bent at impossible angles, jaws that hung too wide, eyes clouded with cataracts. But when they moved together in rhythm, chanting guttural words that echoed through the hollows, the effect was terrifyingly unified. One of the most disturbing details came from a coal miner in the 1940s, who claimed he was captured by the porters and forced to watch a ritual. He said that before the killing began, a child was brought forward barely 7 years old, its face blank, holding a knife fashioned from sharpened rib bone. Under the guidance of older clan members, the child carved into the victim with steady, deliberate cuts. The miner escaped by sheer chance, running blind through the trees until he collapsed at a nearby town. His testimony was written off as the ranting of a traumatized man. But his scars told another story. The porters' obsession with spirals grew deeper during this time. They didn't just carve them into trees and bones, they cut them into their own skin. Entire families were marked with whorls and swirls, carved so deep they scarred into permanent ridges. Some bore matching designs, as if each spiral bound them together in a grotesque covenant. According to legend, the more spirals a porter wore, the closer they were to the Red Law, a phrase no outsider could ever truly define. The clan's notoriety reached new heights in the 1950s, when law enforcement finally made a concentrated effort to wipe them out. After decades of disappearances, mutilations, and whispered warnings, the state organized a raid on Bloodroot Ridge. Armed officers, dogs, and even dynamite were brought to flush the porters from their lair. The plan seemed airtight, but what happened next became a story no one wanted to repeat. As the raid party approached the ridge, they found the forest eerily silent. Dogs refused to advance, whining and pulling back against their leashes. When the officers pressed forward, they stumbled into an abandoned camp. Skins stretched on frames fluttered in the wind, fires still smoldered, and dozens of spirals were carved into the dirt. But the porters themselves were nowhere to be seen. Then the screaming began. Accounts differ, but every surviving officer agreed on one detail. The porters didn't run, they hunted. Pale figures emerged from the treetops, crawling on all fours, dropping onto the backs of officers like wild animals. Others appeared from the undergrowth, silent until they were close enough to strike. Men with rifles were dragged into the dark, their shots muffled by the howls of attackers. Within minutes, the raid collapsed into chaos. One officer described seeing Thomas Redis' grandson, a hulking figure with a jaw so wide it seemed broken, charging through the trees, swinging a rusted hatchet. Behind him, children with sharpened sticks jabbed at the fallen, giggling in eerie unison. The officer barely escaped with his life, covered in scratches that would scar him permanently. The raid was never repeated. Official reports were buried. Unofficially, the word spread. The porters could not be stopped. In the years that followed, the clan became even more brazen. Travelers, who wandered too close to Bloodroot Ridge, reported hearing what they called the blood choir, a haunting chorus of voices screaming in perfect rhythm. Others saw bonfires burning on distant hills, figures silhouetted against the flames as they moved in grotesque dances. When locals dared to investigate the aftermath, they found scorched earth, littered with bones, spirals drawn in ash, and the smell of cooked flesh heavy in the air. The most chilling tale came from 1961, when a group of teenagers dared each other to camp near the ridge. Only one survived, a girl who stumbled back into town at sunrise, barefoot and covered in scratches. She claimed the porters had surrounded their camp in the night, whispering in voices that weren't entirely human. One by one, her friends were dragged into the trees. She swore she saw them tied to posts, torches circling, and then silence. The next morning, searchers found nothing but a circle of ash and spirals cut into the dirt where the teens had camped. The bodies were never recovered. By the 1970s, the Porter clan was a legend whispered in every Appalachian town. Some claimed they had finally died off, their inbreeding collapsing the bloodline into extinction. Others believed they had simply gone deeper underground, retreating into caves where no one could follow. And then there were those who swore the porters weren't entirely human anymore, that whatever red law they had devoted themselves to had transformed them into something else. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the porters weren't finished. Their hunger was eternal. Their spirals kept appearing, and those who entered the ridge alone had a way of never coming back. The grisly secrets of the Porter clan were far from over, because whispers began to spread of something even darker, something that suggested the porters had crossed the final threshold from human monsters into something Appalachia itself had birthed. If the porters had died with the raid of the 1950s or the disappearances of the 1960s, their legend might have faded into another Appalachian ghost story. But the truth is more sinister. The Porter name still lingers not in census records or graveyards, but in whispers of modern encounters that sound too consistent, too detailed, to dismiss as folklore. By the 1980s, hikers began reporting strange discoveries around Bloodroot Ridge, fresh spirals cut into trees, still oozing sap, deer gutted and displayed in the same grotesque fashion as human victims decades earlier. Entire campsites stripped bare, their fires still warm but the campers themselves missing. Authorities brushed it off as animal attacks, but locals knew. The signs? The porters are still here, they muttered, and they're watching. One chilling account came from 1987, when a photographer exploring abandoned mining tunnels near the ridge found evidence of habitation. Inside the tunnels were crude beds made from skins, piles of bones sorted by size, and spirals carved deep into the rock. On one wall was a crude mural, dozens of stick figures arranged around a central spiral, their limbs bent unnaturally. The photographer swore he heard breathing in the darkness. His camera was recovered weeks later by searchers, but his body was never found. In the 1990s, thrill-seekers drawn by the Porter legend claimed to have captured evidence on camcorders. The footage, grainy and erratic, showed pale figures moving just beyond the flashlight beams too fast, too silent to be normal people. At one point, the camera caught what appeared to be a child crouched in the brush, its face slack, eyes glowing eerily in the light. The explorers fled, abandoning their equipment. When others went back to retrieve it, they found only the spiral carved into the dirt where the group had camped by the early 2000s. The Porter stories had shifted from grotesque killings to something even stranger. Survivors described seeing entire groups moving in absolute silence, their steps in unison as if choreographed. Others spoke of hearing whispers in their own voices, an auditory trick that drew them deeper into the woods until they realized too late they were surrounded. One hunter swore the Porters had developed a way of blending into the trees, their bodies painted with mud and blood, their movements so synchronized they seemed like shadows. Perhaps the most terrifying evidence surfaced in 2011 when exploring the caves beneath Bloodroot Ridge, stumbled upon what they called the Red Chapel. The cavern stretched high overhead, its walls covered in spirals carved into stone. In the center was a mound of bones arranged in tiers like pews, and at the top stood a crude altar made from bound timbers and human spines. The explorers found jars filled with preserved eyes and organs, some so fresh they couldn't have been decades old. Their footage ended abruptly when the sound of low chanting echoed through the cave, followed by the camera dropping to the floor. Only one spelunker made it out, babbling about faces that weren't human anymore. Today, locals avoid Bloodroot Ridge altogether. Hunters refuse to track game there, and even law enforcement won't patrol the area after dark. They say the Porters are still there, changed, but not gone. Some believe the clan perfected their rituals, merging themselves with something beyond human. Others think they've simply adapted, breeding generation after generation in secret, their deformities becoming something almost monstrous. Modern sightings describe figures with limbs too long, jaws that open too wide, and eyes that glow faintly in moonlight. They move in groups, never alone, and always in spirals, circling their prey before closing in. And when the last survivor stumbles back to civilization, their stories are always the same. The chanting, the masks of skin, the endless spirals. Folk argue the Porters may have tapped into something far older than themselves, some primal current of Appalachia that thrives on blood sacrifice. The spirals, they say, aren't random, they're gateways, symbols meant to bind or summon. If that's true, then the Porters weren't just killing for cruelty. They were feeding something vast and unseen, hidden beneath the mountains. And maybe that's why their story never ends, because the Porters aren't just a family, they're a legacy, a doctrine, a blood-soaked faith passed down through generations, etched into the land itself. So when you hear the forest grow silent near Bloodroot Ridge, when you see spirals carved fresh into bark, when you feel eyes on you though no one is there, remember this: the Porters never left. They never died. They're waiting. And for them, blood is not just survival, it's worship. The Porters were never just killers. They were zealots of flesh, architects of rituals that turned pain into worship, spirals into scripture, and blood into currency. And if the stories are true, they didn't vanish when the world changed. They adapted, hidden in the bones of Appalachia, still feeding the red law they carved into every hollow. Some say the Porters are watching even now, waiting for those foolish enough to wander into Bloodroot Ridge. Maybe you'll see the spirals carved fresh into trees. Maybe you'll hear the chants in the dark. Or maybe you won't see them at all until it's already too late. But the Porters are just one cursed name in Appalachia's endless night. There are other families, other clans, each with their own blood-soaked legacies, still buried in the mountains. So if you're ready to descend even deeper into the darkness, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments, would you spend a night in Bloodroot Ridge, or would you never set foot there at all? Remember, Appalachia keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets keep feeding.